All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. I guess for me, it is 2:04 in the afternoon, but I know where you guys are all over the place. It's much later, I think. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Christine Chappell, and I'm a friend of Anne. We are colleagues and friends through the Biblical Counseling Coalition, which is an organization here in the States. Well, actually, it's a global coalition, but a lot of us do work here in the United States, and then we meet a couple times a year to fellowship and get to know what all is going on in the biblical counseling world on a global level. And so, really thankful for Anne's partnership there and for her ministry work in Europe. And thankful for the opportunity to join you guys here to talk about the subject of mainly depression, but depression and motherhood is what the book that Anne had shared with you before previously, Midnight Mercies, Walking with God Through Depression and Motherhood, is about. And so while we're still given a few more minutes for people to join, a little bit about me. I am an ACBC certified biblical counselor. I am the host of the Hope and Help podcast with the Institute for Biblical Counseling and Discipleship, also known as IBCD, and been doing that podcast for almost 6 years now. And we host biblical conversations on life's challenging problems, and so lots of great free audios and interviews there through the podcast. And I've also written a number of different resources for the biblical counseling movement. The book we're talking about today, but also my newest one is called Postpartum Depression, Hope for a Hard Season. And that is a mini book. And I've written also two other mini books, Help, I've been diagnosed with a mental disorder, and Help, my teen is depressed. And so you can probably get the sense from those books there that a lot of my ministry revolves around the topic of depression, sorrow, sadness, mental disorders, suicidal ideation, and things of that nature. Not very happy topics, but very necessary topics. And they stem from my own experiences. And so when I speak or write on these topics, it is coming from a place of um, journey that God has brought me through when I was a teenager and then into adulthood. And so I have a place in my heart for those who are suffering these types of problems just because I was there for a very long time. And so I know how painful it can be. I have been previously hospitalized in the psychiatric hospital twice. So I know what that experience is like. Been previously diagnosed with all sorts of mental disorders. So I know what that is like. And by the grace of God, those are not problems that I struggle with or live with anymore. But I definitely did live with and struggle with them for a number of years. And so thankful for God's faithfulness to bear fruit from those painful experiences for the purposes of comforting those, right, with the comfort that I have received on that journey. And so, oh, I've also been married for 23 years and I have three kids and two dogs, and I live in South Carolina. I think that covers all the bases, right? And I think that's it. Does that work for an introduction?
Absolutely, that's great.
Okay, so can I get, I'm green light to start? Okay. Okay, so we are going to get started. And again, thank you for your patience as I do not have my PowerPoint to share with you because I don't have any internet connection. I don't know what happened, but it's been out for hours. And so I'm here on my phone. I'm doing the best that we can and would love to pray and ask for God's help right now, just to keep the connection clear so that we can have this time together and that we can huddle around his word for the hope and help that we're looking for in regards to this topic. So let me pray and then we'll dive straight in. Okay. All right. Heavenly Father God, thank you so much for the gift of technology. Thank you for gathering us from all corners of the world this evening, this afternoon, so that we can learn more about you, about who you are in the midst of the darkness, God, about how you view us when we are struggling with hopelessness and despair, and how we might be able to minister to moms who are experiencing depression in a way that is compassionate and redemptive. So, Lord, would you please open our eyes to see, open our hearts to receive your word, and help us to be useful instruments in your hand by the power of your spirit. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. All right. So, where should I start? I don't have my PowerPoint to share. So, I guess what I'll go ahead and do is just kind of offer you four main points. So, if you're taking notes, then great. You can write these bullet points down. These are going to kind of be the four main headers that we're going to go through during our next 50 or so minutes together. And I recognize that it's always one of those things where it's like, I'm afraid I'm going to not have enough to talk about. And then the hour goes by fast. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't get to everything. And so I'll try to squeeze in as much helpful information as I can while also acknowledging the reality that I cannot possibly say everything there is to be said about depression or depression in motherhood or anything, no person can. And in the 60-minute presentation. And so I'm really just trying to offer maybe some fresh ways of thinking about this problem, of thinking of how to help those who are suffering in this way, so that either if you are experiencing or have experienced depression before in the context of motherhood, that you'll be helped, maybe to take your next step in a particular area. But then also, if you are caring for those who are walking through depression and motherhood, you will feel equipped with a few more tools or resources or kind of avenues to go down as you walk alongside that woman who is suffering. And so the overview, I like to use the same letters. And so there's four E's. So the four E's for this overview for the presentation are experience. So E, experience. And then so the experience of depression is what that means. And then we will talk about the emotions of depression. So experience, emotion. Then we're going to think about the engagement of depression, meaning our responses to that experience. And then lastly, expectations. So, what are our redemptive, biblical, helpful, productive expectations to have as we are navigating depression? So, those four E's: experience, emotion, engagement, and expectation. And we see these E's kind of thrown all throughout Midnight Mercies. Now, Midnight Mercies is a resource written for the sufferer, not for the person who is doing the counseling. So I've packaged today's presentation to be more for the counselor and not necessarily the person who is suffering, although I think it can be helpful either way. But just to kind of put that out there, that's not how the four E's is not how this book is presented, but it's how I want to present some of its content to you today. And so, as we think about the experience of depression, and I'm sorry, I have to look at my screens and then look up at the phone. So, if my eyes wander, it's not because I'm not paying attention to you, it's because I got notes to look at and it's all over the place. But the experience of depression, when I'm teaching about the subject of depression, and again, I guess another disclaimer that's helpful to say is I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not coming at this from a licensed therapist perspective. I'm coming mainly at this from someone who has personally experienced depression, but then too, who has gone through, training in biblical counseling to help walk alongside those who are suffering. So that's kind of the angle that I take when we're talking about depression. And so I like to point out what can be so easily forgotten. I think, particularly when it comes to wanting to counsel someone, a woman in particular, with our Bibles on the topic of depression, it's tempting to oversimplify her problem. And so I think it's helpful to remember that number one, depression, I like to say it, is a multifaceted human experience, meaning that this is a common problem to all of man, right? Not just to mothers, not just to postpartum mothers, not just to women. People of all ages and stages can suffer from the experience of depression for a number of different reasons. And I'll explain a little bit of those influencing factors here in just a minute. But I think it is important as we move on through our conversation today about this topic to remember that, right? To remember that we want to actually broaden our vision, broaden the scope of what is going on in the sufferer's world, because we may be prone to black or white thinking where we say, oh, it's because of this, oh, it's because of that. And then we focus just on that one thing without actually seeing the whole picture, seeing the whole world of the person who is suffering. And we know that, I'm sure we all can look at our own worlds. I mean, I'm looking at my world right now. You can't see it because I've got this background stage very nicely for my usual presentations, but the whole other side of this room is in shambles because we had a flood in our basement. So there's layers that if we just focus on what's behind me, you would say, oh, there's nothing wrong with Christine's world right now. Look, everything is staged so nice, but I've got holes and a septic tank overflowing in my front yard. And so like we've got to remember that people's worlds there's so much more going on than just what we see right in front of us when we are speaking to someone who is depressed. And so remembering depression and the experience of it as a multifaceted that there are many facets to the experience, I think is helpful. And also the reality that we don't want to forget we are ministering or caring for a whole person. And that whole personhood is important because, again, we don't want to run the risk of oversimplifying the problem. And when I say the term whole person, what I'm really talking about is the reality that we were created by God, right? Genesis 2:7, we read that then God formed the man from dust from the ground and then breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living creature. And so, right out of the creation account, we see that in terms of who we are as whole people, as human beings, we are dust and breath, body and soul, right? Flesh and spirit. And so, ministering to someone who is navigating depression means that if you are going to benefit this person, you have to care for the whole person because they're not 90% body and 10% soul. You can't parse them apart like that. These are embodied souls that need care, both body and soul. And so we want to remember that whole person inclusion in our care, or even if we're suffering, we want to remember that as we care for ourselves or as we seek care for our experience of depression, that we need to be seeking out care in both avenues for our whole person, not just part of ourselves, but our whole selves. There is a helpful chart that talks about this. I would love to show you if I could. And I'll send this to Anne if maybe Anne can make a note to remind me. It's a chart that talks about influences of the heart. But what is, I think, really helpful on this point before we move on to emotion is that it's called the nested circles diagram, and Anne might be familiar with that. I think originated with David Powelson from CCEF, but it helps, I think, to really like I said, to broaden our awareness or our scope of the person who is suffering, because it's a series of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 circles. And like those stacking cups when you were a baby, and there's a small cup, and then that goes into a bigger cup, and then that goes into a bigger cup. And so think of that when it's talking about nested circles. It's about, we're starting off small, and then we're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so in that diagram, what is really helpful is that at the very center of these circles, David puts the human heart. I'm going to bring it up so I can see it a bit more clearly for me. Okay, yeah. So the human heart. So at the center of our experience of depression is the human heart. Like we talked about, we are embodied souls, and our bodies have souls that live inside of them, particularly the Holy Spirit, right? But in terms of the heart itself, the heart is the center of human emotion, behavior, thoughts, actions, and motivations. And we see the scriptures talk a lot about that, particularly Proverbs 4:23 talks about keeping your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. And then Jesus himself talks about the heart in Matthew 15:18. And he says that what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. So, just that idea of the heart being at the center of our volition, our will, our desires, but that human heart is physically embodied, right? It exists in a broken body, a cursed body that is impacted by age, by imperfections, by forgetfulness, joint pain, depression, menopause, disability. There are all different types of weaknesses and limitations that are not necessarily connected to sin, right? But that are exerting influence or pressure on the heart. And so we need to remember that there are other a part that we're also embodied. But then in above and beyond that, I love to see even in the creation account too, Adam was created, but then he was basically socially embedded, right? The Lord created a helper for him. And so we have these hearts, they're embodied, and then we are put in social situations. We have families, we have friends, we have church affiliations, we have coworkers, colleagues. Um, and our responses to our worlds are shaped or influenced by our situation or our story that exists in the context of social influences. And so the past and our past experiences with other people in relationship can determine our responses to our present hardships. Doesn't determine necessarily. There we go. Thank you, Anne, for finding that. How wonderful! What a great assistant you are here. Yeah, so you can see what I'm talking about and probably didn't very clearly explain, but hopefully this makes more sense. So I'm at the socially embedded circle here, and remembering that a sufferer of depression is having to exist and go through that experience in the context of social relationships, present relationships, but also even influences from past, maybe destructive or toxic or whatever word term you want to say, painful past relationships. That are influencing what she might think or even choose for herself. So definitely that influence, that layer is to be remembered. But then the reality too, that next circle there that you see on the screen, that we are spiritually embattled. And again, going back to the creation account, we even see that on display the when the when Satan comes and tempts Adam and Eve to eat of the apple. And so there are spiritual forces at work in the physical world. The enemy is hard at work seeking to influence us away from God. And we see in Ephesians 6:12 talks about that, about um, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, and cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. And then also First Peter 5:8 is talking about that. Look, Satan is out to get those who are weak and weary and hopeless and wondering where is God in the midst of their pain. Not Jesus, Satan is there, seeking to devour that one in their moment of weakness. And so we need to be mindful of that as well. But I think the most encouraging part of this whole diagram, and then we'll move forward, is to remember that all of this brokenness and this spiritual embattlement and these social influences and these broken bodies and even the sin and the sinful desires and lusts of our own human hearts, all of this God still reigns over. He is the God of providence. And so he works through all secondary causes to execute his good and perfect will, meaning that he is in charge. He is nothing is going on in this person's world that he doesn't know about or that he is surprised by. He's not surprised by any of this person's struggles either. And so we need to remember, I think this chart helps us to have a wider view of the person who is suffering. And also, before we move on, you look at this and you might think, oh goodness, wow, that's a lot. That's a lot going on. Well, good. We should have that, oh goodness, that's a lot going on reminder, because again, it helps us to resist the temptation to oversimplify the problem that this person is going through, or even the I hate to say the word solutions, but the different responses or supports that this person might need to bear up under the burden of depression a uh, while they're waiting for light to return, right? Waiting for that light to come back. The light of life, the Bible calls Jesus is the light of life. And so sometimes when we are walking through depression, um, it takes courageous dependence to wait for that light to return. And how can we help people to do that? And so anyway, I want to thank you, Anne, for bringing that up on the screen. And if anybody wants a copy of that, I'm sure she could send it out. But it's a helpful reference so that we have a more holistic view of what may be going on in the sufferer's world, and to realize that the remedies or the solutions that we offer is going to look like a lot of different things at once, not just, oh, here's the one thing you need to do and then everything will be fine. That we don't want to oversimplify or even overpromise in that regard. And so moving on to emotion. There are a few different points I want to offer on this particular area for emotion and the different emotional facets that are common to the experience of depression. But before I do, I want to talk about the concept of felt reality. And I'm sorry, I'm getting over the flu also, in addition to everything else. And so my throat's dry. I'm going to have a sip of tea. But if I have to like clear my throat, that's why, is because I'm still a little under the weather. But I thought you guys are in Europe. You have a lot of tea, right? Or is that just England? And do you guys drink tea? Is tea a European? Everyone loves tea, or
Europeans tend to drink other things. Um,
okay,
um, for example, coffee.
yeah, yeah, okay. Well, this is decaf. I can't have coffee, or else I'll stay up too late. But anyway, so I was just going to say I was having my English tea time, but maybe there's no one in England on this call, so that's okay. Any case, so felt reality. And this is a term that I actually got from Joe Rigney, an article that he wrote on desiring God. If you want to look it up, it's called Submit Your Felt Reality to God. And I found this article to be so helpful, and the concept of felt reality that he described, that he actually learned from a counselor friend. And so I don't know who the counselor friend was. This did not originate with me, but I'm passing it along to you because I think it's very helpful. It's a helpful term. And listen to what he says about felt reality. Again, his name is Joe Rigney. The article is called Submit Your Felt Reality to God. And he says that reality is reality. It's objective. It's what's actually happening. But felt reality is what's happening from my vantage point. It's reality framed by my own thoughts, assumptions, and emotions. So, distinguishing felt to reality, what I feel to be true, right? From my vantage point, this is what seems to be true. From my assumptions, from the emotions I'm feeling, from the thoughts I'm having, these are the conclusions I'm drawing. That is felt reality. And there may be actual real reality mixed into that, right? But it's a subjective reality, not an objective reality. And let me maybe put an example to that for you. I think Job is a really great way to kind of connect the dots on this, because Job's felt reality, by the time he gets to Job, I think 30 or 31, I'm sorry, I don't have it here, but it's actually what we talk about in the anger chapter on Midnight Mercies. Job gets to a point on his journey and his suffering and his loss where he basically says, God, you have become cruel to me, right? He says God is acting cruel toward him. And so that was his felt reality. His felt reality in that moment was that God, this is happening because God has turned cruel. Now, obviously, we know that that was not the whole of reality. That was a partial, that was Job's experience of what was happening to him. But we know from the scriptures that there was a whole conversation in heaven, that God was not letting all of this catastrophe and suffering happen to Job because he had turned cruel, right? It was a whole other thing going on there. And so there's, I guess you could even split it and say there's God's reality, right, which is the objective truth, the whole reality, and that includes mysteries that we don't know about, that we can't see all of actual reality. But felt reality, I think, is a helpful term when we are talking about depression, because that's a lot of what we're dealing with when we are coming alongside to help someone who is suffering, or if you are a sufferer yourself, then that is maybe a helpful term to help you to see, okay, this is what I'm feeling. And based on what I'm thinking, my assumptions, and what I'm feeling, thinking, and assumptions, these are the connections I'm making. This is the conclusions I'm drawing based on what I'm feeling, thinking, and assuming, not necessarily because I have all the information to draw accurate conclusions objectively. And so felt reality has been a helpful category for me. It's not to say that it's wrong necessarily. Felt reality can sometimes line up very well with reality. But I think in the experience of depression, we can often find that a lot of weight can be given to our felt reality in a way that is actually destructive, um, depending on how we respond to it, which we'll talk about here in a few minutes. Emotional facets. So, common emotional facets to the experience of depression. Midnight Mercies, this is all of what Midnight Mercies is really about, is exploring the different emotional facets of the experience of depression. And now somebody might listen and say, well, I thought depression was just, you just feel nothing. And so you don't have any emotions. And that is actually can be describing apathy, which is a kind of emotion. And so, but I think where I'm trying to come from in terms of what I write in Midnight Mercies is that there's a helpful quote from Ed Welch in his book on depression. And he says that there are times when depression is saying something and we must listen, right? So, again, that from the heart, as we listen to the groans of the heart, which are coming out of the mouth of the sufferer, we can trace those words and connect them to emotional experiences like hopelessness. When we are listening to someone who is depressed, as they are describing their felt reality, what is it like to be them today, right? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? And actually, before I even do that, let me give you some examples of what it might sound like. So, someone might say, I feel misunderstood or mishandled by other people. If only I was different, I would be worthy of love. If God was good, I wouldn't be suffering. I feel like a failure and a burden to my family. I feel like no matter what I do, nothing changes. I feel like I'm praying to a brick wall. I feel unseen, unwanted, and unclean. My sorrow has swallowed me whole. I feel like life has no meaning or purpose. I should be doing better than this. I've forgotten what happiness is. I can't live like this anymore. I must not be saved after all. Life will never be any different for me. God is disappointed in me. I feel like I'm at the end of my rope. It seems like I've ruined everything. The future is bleak. There's no hope. So we need to, as people helpers, we want to listen. What is the heart saying? Because as we listen to these statements that are heart-wrenching, and it's painful to be in a spot to say these things, whether you're saying them to yourself or you're saying them to someone else, is so painful. But as we listen, we can discern that there are emotions underneath these statements. I mentioned one already, hopelessness. What I just read just reeks of hopelessness, but also of weariness, right? That feeling like you're downright defeated, that you're sick and tired of being sick and tired. Sadness is also often intermingled with depression, as well as anger. In fact, in Ed Welch's book on depression, he has a helpful equation, not to oversimplify it, of course, but I think it is helpful when we talk about emotions. He says that sadness plus anger equals depression. And so you can also kind of look at depression as sometimes being an angry grief. And studies have shown, and I get this from Dr. Hodge's book, Good Mood, Bad Mood, help and Hope for Depression and Bipolar Disorder, I think is the subtitle. But he quotes from studies that have shown that the majority of diagnoses of depression are grief or identified no wait attached to grief or identifiable loss, meaning that this person is suffering because of some kind of identifiable loss in their life. Now, I'm not saying that's all the time. Sometimes somebody is suffering, they have no idea why, right? But that's not the majority of the time this study found. And so listening for angry grief at the experience of depression is something that can be helpful. Also, anxiety, shame and loneliness. So, hopelessness, weariness, sadness, anger, anxiety, shame, and loneliness. And in Midnight Mercies, I offer biblical narratives where we see real believers struggling with these very emotions, saying some of these very things that I just repeated to you. This list that I read from of expressions is actually in the introduction of Midnight Mercies. And so you could, if you get the book on ebook or wherever you can, it's an audiobook too, but I don't know how it works in Europe with buying books from the US. But yeah, that list is there in the book for you. But those are the emotions we go through in Midnight Mercies, namely to help give voice to the experience and help women who are suffering or sufferers of any, even if they're not women, but these narratives apply to anyone who's struggling with these emotions. And we begin to see that despair and hopelessness and desperation are common experiences of real believers. I mean, Moses wanted to die. In Numbers 11, we see his wrestling with hopelessness and feeling like God had given him way too much with way too few resources to do. And moms often feel that way, like they're being called to do way too much with way too little. And they just get to a point where they say, I can't take this anymore, like Moses did. And weariness, we see that in 1 Kings 19 and Elijah's experience. I'm not going to comb through all of these different biblical narratives, but I'll offer you the references here for you to explore on your own. And then if you want additional help, you could go to Midnight Mercies, but just for the sake of time, I'll say where the narratives are. Weariness, we see that in Elijah, 1 Kings 19. Sadness, we can go to the story of Mary and Martha after their brother Lazarus dies in John 11 and watch them actually lament and turn to the Lord in their sorrow and wrestle with that hard question of, if Jesus loved us, then why did he let this happen? Right? We see people who sometimes in depression are wrestling with that very question. Right? If God loved me, then why won't he help me to stop feeling this way? Or why did he let this bad thing happen in my life? Anger in Job's story, we see that. Anxiety, we see that in Gideon's story from Judges 6. And shame, the bleeding woman in Mark 5 is a great place to go for a case study on that emotion. And then loneliness, to observe Naomi in her grief in the book of Ruth. And so, as we consider these different emotional facets, it helps us to have a starting place for a meaningful conversation where we're not just sitting around saying, I'm depressed, I'm depressed, I'm depressed, and never really getting to the heart of what's going on in my soul, right? What is it where I feel like I am inconsolable? And what can I do to take my next step out of that, or at least with the Lord in that? And so it's helpful to have a good place to start, and those narratives can help us to explore not only our own emotional experiences in depression and motherhood, but also God's view of us as we are wrestling with those particular emotions. Because the temptation in depression can, of course, be that, I mean, it's not a temptation, it's the reality is that we're not seeing a whole lot of things clearly, right? We've got our felt reality, and the pain is so, large, our sadness or our numbness is so in our face, so pervasive that we are having a perception problem. We're not seeing things clearly. And one of the most important things that we can possibly not be seeing clearly is, of course, Jesus himself, or God, the Father himself. And so we may fear that he is angry or distant or ignoring us or forsaking us or abandoning us or doesn't care, or he is just mean, or like Job says, cruel. And so in these particular, as we explore these different emotional facets and go through these narratives, we begin to see the heart of God. We begin to see his mercy as he engages people in the midst of their pain and desperation and hopelessness and weariness and sadness and anger and anxiety, shame and loneliness, and how he meets them where they are at and helps them to take their next step in their story. And that is a helpful, that's helped, it helped me. So that's why I'm passionate about sharing, because this was how the Lord walked me through my own experiences of depression. In fact, in Midnight Mercies, I write about a week I spent in the mental hospital, after thinking of ways to die for multiple weeks, and then harming myself after drinking a bottle of wine, and reaching out to my husband the next morning saying that I wanted to die and that I had hurt myself and I didn't know what else to do. So I'm giving you a brief synopsis of that situation. I, again, write about it in Midnight Mercies, but even in the midst of all of that, that pain and that suffering, right, God met me where I was at and helped me to take next steps, in a way that totally changed my life. And so, moving on into the still the same topic of emotions, but I want to also offer, I think, a distinction that might be helpful as you are considering, especially if you're a caregiver, but if you're a sufferer, this may be helpful too as you reflect on your, what are your tendencies when you do feel depressed or sad or overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, right? As Jesus would say in the Garden of Gethsemane, he said that. Not to say Jesus was depressed, but he knows even what it is to be overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Um, to have these two categories I call it for sadness, so safe sadness and dangerous sadness. And I have an appendix in Midnight Mercies that talks about this. All right, but this I think is helpful, in the context of just any kind of discussion on depression when we're trying to figure out, well, is what I'm going through, like, I quoted that, I didn't quote it, but I referenced that study about, the majority of depression diagnoses are from sufferers who have identifiable loss in their lives that it is connected to. And so sometimes grief, right, grief, anger, depression, it can all kind of make a big muddy mess sometimes. And so we want to think about, well, when is this person and what they're going through is grief mixed with anger, and not necessarily a clinical depression where they're like, I don't have any idea what's going on or why I'm feeling this way. And so making that distinction between safe sadness and dangerous sadness can be helpful. And here's why: is because we don't want to stigmatize somebody's experience of grief, right? Especially if they are doing all the things that they know how to do to engage the Lord in the midst of that grief. So sadness can be safe. Sadness can be a productive emotion when it drives us to Jesus, right, for our hope and our help. And so, as we are lamenting to the Lord, as we are bringing our cares before Him, as we are weeping, rightly so, over sad things. It's not wrong to be sad over sad things, right? Jesus Himself was man of sorrows. He was sad over sad things. We can be sad about sad things too. Sometimes that is a right response to what it is that we're going through or we're suffering. And as we engage the Lord in that sadness, then it's not depression that we're experiencing, right? It's grief that we're experiencing in a relationship with our Lord. And in that way, as we seek to submit it to Him and take comfort and courage from Him, and then take our next step with Him through that, that is a safe sadness. We don't need to try to scoot people past that, or tell them that they're doing something wrong because they're in Jesus, or that they're in that sadness with the Lord, and He's ministering to them where they are. And so, just that idea of safe sadness, and I even think of the Psalm. Where is it? I wrote it down and now I can't. Oh, here it is. Psalm 16:1, where David says, "Keep me safe, my God, for in you I take refuge." And that is a psalm of lament. And it's just a beautiful reminder from David. It's like, keep me safe, my God, for in you I take refuge, that concept of safe sadness there we see. But then there are times when the sadness turns dangerous. And that is where I was at when I was hospitalized. When Jesus does not seem like a real and present refuge to run to, and there are a number of reasons why he may not seem that way for someone who is depressed. But when he does not seem like a real and present refuge to run to, then we may try to take relief into our own hands by turning to other false refuges, such as alcohol, self harm, pornography, food, any type of reckless behavior, or even really responsible behavior like cleaning, exercise. Like good things can become destructive when we are using them for self medication or self soothing, to the degree that we actually end up harming ourselves. And so now we're turning to something other than the Lord for the comfort and relief that we're looking for. And so that's when the sadness can become actually very destructive, is when we are using other things apart from the Lord for our comfort, our refuge, our relief, our hope, even. And so making that distinction can be helpful, because you may be working with someone who's just having, they're processing their grief and they need help processing that grief, and that takes time. But you may then be working with someone who is in need of practical support to manage those temptations toward dangerous responses, especially if they are feeling like they may harm themselves. Then, as we care for that person who may be in a dangerous sadness situation, we want to intervene and help to provide a safety plan, and do some practical measures that can help get them in a safety zone in terms of processing that emotional pain in a redemptive and productive way, and not a destructive way. And so I talk about that in Midnight Mercies a little bit more, but hopefully just even that distinction itself in terms of safe and dangerous, we can make a distinction of which are the refuges that I tend to go to when I'm feeling this emotional pain or this hopelessness. How am I coping with that? And even just that answer in itself can provide a meaningful conversation for further exploration. So engagement, a couple of ideas for engaging, uh, if you are counseling, right? So helping someone to engage their experience of depression. And what do I mean by that? Is obviously, as caregivers, as biblical counselors, we want to help people to come to a better understanding of who God is in the midst of their pain. And as they do so, they will begin to better understand their own selves to some degree. You can't always have complete, perfect self knowledge, right? But we can learn things about our own hearts, about where we turn to in times of trouble and distress. Where are we looking for affirmation and love from? Where do we find assurance of God's love from? Where have we set our hope on? I mean, there's so many different things that these conversations can help us to dig up as we engage them wisely. But I think one of the ways to helpfully engage depression in as a mom, but at any context, I guess, is through the practice of biblical lament. And I really do feel like this is one of those things, like, I wish I would have known. I always used to love leaning on the Psalms when I was going through different seasons of depression. I didn't really know that they were lament psalms. I just knew that they were putting words to my felt reality, right, in a way that I couldn't describe on my own, and that it was helpful to me at the time. And so, teaching what biblical lament is, what it is used for. I guess you could say it's a prayer language, for when we are experiencing pain. How do we talk to God about that pain? How do we talk to God about our disappointment, our discouragement, our sorrow, our grief? How do we talk to Him about oppression or injustice or our own unrighteousness? All these different psalms of lament, they tackle different, aspects of Christian living. But I think one of the more encouraging things to remember as we talk about biblical lament and teach mothers how to lament is the reminder from Psalm 62:8, where the psalmist says, "Trust in Him at all times, O people. pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. And so the concept that God is not surprised by our emotional overwhelm. We may be surprised as moms, right, by our emotional overwhelm at times, but God is not surprised. He knew every single overwhelming day we were going to have before there was even one of them. And so while we didn't know that that meltdown was going to happen, maybe we didn't foresee that, he knows all about the meltdowns, all about the tantrums, all about the crying on the bathroom floor, all about the hurt and the pain and the cruel words and the mishandle, being mishandled by others. I mean, he knows and he sees all of that. And his invitation is for us as, sufferers to pour out our heart to him because he is a refuge for us. And so that is an invitation, I think, that is so precious for a struggling mom to know that she can be authentic in her expressing her lament to the Lord, her emotion, while at the same time learning how to be reverent in that as well. Like that's what the study of biblical lament can help us to do, is to balance that authenticity with reverence. When we pray to the Lord, it's an act of worship. So how do we engage the Lord in a way that that honors him, but also is worshiping in spirit and truth, as Jesus says? I think that's another verse that it's, I think in John, I'm sorry, I don't have the reference here, but that's what it looks like to worship God in spirit and in truth, right? Is to not come to him with pretense about what it is that we're going through or what we're feeling, but that to give it to him in truth as an act of worship, and then to walk through the process of biblical lament, which takes us through 4 different components, which I don't have time to go into today. I have a lot of resources on biblical lament on my website, and in the index of Midnight Mercies, we also talk about this as well. But I'll just offer, the 4 main points of the framework of lament are engaging God, so turning to him, voicing our complaints, asking for his help, and then committing to trust. So engage God, voice complaint, ask for help, commit to trust. And so those are for, if you're familiar with Dark Clouds, Deep Mercies, that framework comes from Mark Vroegop, but I write about it in Midnight Mercies as well. The other part of engagement that I think is an important part of this conversation for depression is what I call body stewardship. But my take on body stewardship isn't necessarily what you might think it is. And so what I mean by body stewardship is above and beyond general body care. Okay, so obviously, diet, to the degree that we can make changes to diet, and water and vitamins. I mean, all the things that a doctor would tell you to do if you were having any kind of affliction, to care for your body to the best that you are able to do. Exercise is a great thing that doctors will tell us to do for depression, and studies show that is still to this day one of the most effective, I don't want to say treatments, but effective, I don't know, I don't even want to say remedy, but just a supplement. Like, you should do the exercise and it can be helpful. It's a benefit to what it is that your body is wrestling with when you're experiencing depression. Exercise can be beneficial. But what I mean about body stewardship, it actually really comes from 1 Corinthians 6:19. And this was a really important thing for me personally, especially when I was struggling with temptations to self-harm. And I'll read 1 Corinthians 6:19 for you, where Paul writes, "Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body." And so that's what I mean when I say body stewardship, is as we are embodied souls, how do I lead my heart to lead my body? Like, how does my heart even lead my body to submit to the Lord in this situation that I'm in. And a great example for that actually is in the story of Elijah. We see Elijah's body stewardship. Now, it didn't start off great because he fainted and he's like, I know better than my father's, Lord. Just kill me now. I'm done. This is enough, right? And then we know from the story in First Kings 19 that the Lord sent an angel to give him bread and water and to care for his body, right? That's a super practical body stewardship application, right? But what was Elijah's response? I think that sometimes is overlooked. Like Elijah could have said, no, Lord, you didn't hear me the first time. I said, I'm done. No, Lord, I said, I quit. I don't want your bread. I don't want your water. But instead, right, he stewarded his body. He used his will to say, I'm going to receive this bread. I'm going to receive this water because I know God has given it to me to sustain me, because he's not done with me, because I don't belong to him, because he's called me to a purpose and I don't get to choose. I don't get to choose when I go. He's here providing for me. And so there's more to do. And so realizing even in Elijah's situation that there was more to his calling there, and that he did accept the nourishment from the Lord, was an act of stewarding his body for worship and for obedience. And so that's what, in terms of struggling with self harm thoughts, or even the morning when I went to the hospital, that this verse came to mind. And the reality that, to harm myself was to put more marks on the body of Christ. Not literally, but that's how kind of I was thinking of it, because that's how in Christ I am, right? That's how united I am to the Lord. And so I don't want to live in that moment. That's what I was thinking, right? But I don't belong to myself. And so my love for the Lord meant dying to my desire to die in that moment and submitting my body for going to my husband and asking for help, even though my flesh did not want the help, if that makes any sense. And so there's a flesh and spirit, struggle there sometimes with body stewardship, but it is something that we can explore, that we can talk about. And then where there are temptations to harm the body through substances, through injury, and what have you, then of course, have conversations about that so we can, again, get back on a track towards safety, safely engaging our pain and not engaging it in a way that is destructive. And then lastly, for the engagement, community support. So hopefully that is kind of a given, but especially important in for moms in particular, I think, who can oftentimes feel isolated or alone, to have some kind of support system, and it may be very small, it may just be one person, right? But hopefully this person is involved in a local church where we can, as caregivers, if we're not counseling in our local church, then we can reach out to the local church and try to collaborate to ensure that this woman has one or two mentors available who can walk with her, to kind of be more the hands and feet, as we are counseling, maybe on a weekly basis. And then if you're the sufferer here on the call, the importance of community. I talk about it in the hopelessness chapter of Midnight Mercies, where we go into Moses's story and see that when Moses had his meltdown, the first thing that the Lord said after Moses said, "If you're going to treat me like this, just kill me now." And the Lord answered him very mercifully and basically said, "Go find some elders." I don't know. I don't remember the number. It's in the book, but go find some elders, some wise Christians, right? We could say in today's terms, and go down here to the tent, and I will meet you there and talk to you there once you have that group collected. And this is the idea of like Moses's hopelessness could not be extinguished on his own. Like it took spiritual first responders, and for us as well, it takes spiritual first responders, a team of people, community support, as we are navigating depression, to be able to move through it in a way that is honors God, but also is makes the experience at least more bearable for the day. And so that's just some things to think about in terms of engagement. And then lastly, for expectations, and then we'll finish up. So um, I think when it comes to the experience of depression and motherhood in particular, clarifying God's goals is going to be a helpful conversation. And what I experienced personally, and then also what I continue to find in my conversations with moms of all ages and stages, whether they're postpartum and struggling with in the area of expectations, or they're older women and their children have left the nest, and they're feeling past guilt about different things they've done and struggling with assurance in the midst of their depression. Expectations I think, sometimes can be very helpful places to kind of tune into to see where there is some thinking that is not aligned with God's goals. And that also can help us to distinguish different voices that this woman may be listening to, in terms of the mental ticker tape. We know, like, in depression, a lot of times there's a lot of negative self-talk. There's a ticker tape that's just playing on cycles over and over again, and it can seem very difficult to break that ticker tape and then to even discern, where is that coming from? Is that me? Is that something else? And so when we go to expectations, I think that helps to shine a light on some of those facets, I guess you could say. And so clarifying God's goals. A depressed mom doesn't want to be a depressed mom. She's probably tried all kinds of different things to stop being a depressed mom. If she didn't wake up and say, "Oh, I'd love to feel depressed today and just feel like I'm stuck in depression forever," and so there's this really significant discouragement that comes when you are trying everything you know how to do to be a different person, a different woman, a different mother, and you just can't figure it out. And maybe sometimes for a little while you're able to, you know do better, right, in your own strength, but then something else happens, that seems to pull the rug right out of your feet, and or from under your feet, and you fall into despair again. And so it can just kind of be this cycle of, I'm doing good, and then I crash, and then I'm going to do better, I'm going to do better, I'm going to do better, I'm doing good, and then crash again. Just we go round and round and round. And so for me personally, clarifying God's goals for me when I was experiencing depression was not that I would hurry up and figure out how to do better and better and get right on that upward trajectory that I so desperately wanted, because I didn't want to go round and round in circles all the time. His goal was for me to walk with him in those hard moments and to wait on him, to trust that he was working even in my sorrow, and to wait, right, to watch for him, to wait on him, and to kind of shrink down my world to what is walking with Jesus look like for the next 15 minutes with this pain. Not trying to escape this pain, not trying to fix myself or hurry up and get better, right? But just faithfulness here in this moment with my Lord, and leaning on him and resting on his righteousness, right? Resting fully on it. He lived all of these difficult moments perfectly for me, so that I have the freedom to say, Lord, I'm weak and needy, right? Have mercy on me, a sinner, right? Help me, I believe, help my unbelief. Like all of these real expressions of faith that stem from pain and sorrow and despair. Um, and so clarifying that God wasn't expecting me to live a depression free life, which I was expecting me to do that. I was expecting me to figure out how to be sorrow free. And the problem with having expectations that go above and beyond God's is that when they don't come true, then life's not worth living anymore. Life was not worth living for me anymore because I expected to be depression free or to be able to figure it out, and I couldn't. So life was not worth living anymore. I was weary, right? Hopeless. I was sad. I was angry. I was anxious. I felt shame and loneliness, right? And so we can see even expectations can fuel that underturning of despair, um, when we're our motive for even trying anything, right? To do anything anymore is with the goal of not being depressed anymore. Now, it's not to say that we don't want to pursue that goal, right? But that goal can't become the ultimate goal. The goal is I want to glorify God with my life in this depression more than I want to breathe. And that was a helpful statement that ministered to me from Dr. Hodges' book, In Good Mood, Bad Mood. And he uses that sometimes in his own counseling, is getting to a point in our journey where we can, whatever it is that goal that we want so desperately as moms or as sufferers or as whoever you are, it's applicable to everyone, right? But if our goal is, I must have this, right? And if I don't, then life's not worth living anymore. That has become something of an object of worship, so that we will spend all that we have, right? And get nothing in return, no change, no difference. And when that happens, we get weary and hopeless. And so, clarifying for me in that moment during the week I spent in the hospital is when that clarification happened by God's grace, that I had been living for the goal of being depression free, living for the goal of never feeling difficult emotional pain anymore because I was so sick and tired of it, right? Um, the Lord had to show me that I couldn't live for that as the goal because he didn't promise that I would have a sorrow free life. He didn't promise that I would never experience depression, but he promised to walk with me through those difficult emotions, to give me tiny steps that I could take in faithful obedience to him in the midst of those times, so that I could be sustained by his grace, and lean on his love in the midst of those painful emotions. And so, what are the expectations that this counselee has for their depression? And and then how might we need to challenge some of those wayward goals? Again, I say wayward goals because I don't want to say these are not good goals. It's a great goal to do what it is within your power to do, right? To fix a problem that you're having when it is disrupting your life and your relationships. Absolutely, by God's grace, do what he enables you to do with the knowledge that he enables you to have, right? But good goals become wayward and then become objects of worship, right? When we shift them, our hope off of Christ and onto a change in circumstance, which is what I had done. I had shifted my hope onto being depression free and off of Christ alone. Christ alone, who I could serve and love regardless of whether I was depressed or not. It gave me such purpose there to know that I could do something pleasing to the Lord just by being faithful to the thing he put right in front of my face in that moment, right? Which sometimes looked like doing the dishes or making my kids lunch, and knowing that that was pleasing to the Lord, and then trusting that he was going to walk me through the darkness that I was in, as I looked to him and leaned on him in those times. And so, yeah, and then together, the last point here, just committing to faithful goals. And so, having the conversation about expectations, sometimes you'll hear expectations come out in terms of phrases like I should or I shouldn't, right? So, that's how you might be able to identify some expectations in a conversation. Oh, I shouldn't be feeling this way. I shouldn't be crying. I should know how to be better by now. I should know how to deal with this pain. I should or I shouldn't, right? And these are ways of hearing laws. I talk about this a little bit in my postpartum depression mini book. When we hear shoulds and shouldn'ts and always and never statements in depression, I always mess up, or I'm never going to change, or just sweeping statements like that. What we're actually listing is just a bunch of little laws that we've made for ourselves, right? That go above and beyond God's laws for us. His law is love me with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. There you go. That's it. Right. But we add all these other things. Well, I should be able to do this. I shouldn't do that. And should, always, never. And so, and then it burdens us. So there's no freedom in adding those laws to ourselves. Those are self-imposed. Um, it's binding. It's suffocating. And so expectations and exploring expectations, I think, can be helpful part of that overall conversation of what do we think God expects of us in this season versus what do I expect of me in this season, and does it line up? Because I have found in my own experience that it usually did not line up. And I continue to find the same thing in my counseling with other women is that there are a lot of times the expectations of what God is asking them to do and what they're um, expecting themselves to do in the season they're in is out of whack. And so we can challenge that and hopefully commit to helping her to take a look at that and restructure where necessary. And so that's our hour. So much more could be said, and I hope that maybe there was some stuff there that helps you to think maybe a little bit of a fresh perspective. Hopefully, some practical tools that you might implement in your care for others, or if you are a sufferer on the call, maybe some practical insights that help you to, if not understand some of the things that you may be feeling or thinking, but at least to know that the Bible does have hope and help for you in the midst of your pain, and that there are people who want to help on this call right now, right? And so, yeah, that's gosh, there's so many more things I could say, Aaron, but I don't want to be over our time. So